The game is made on Unity, correct? Or is it made on Game Maker?
Actually, RPG Maker.
It is RPG.
MB, but a lot of custom plugins, JavaScript code.
Why RPG Maker? Is it because that was kind of what you've known for so long, or was there a strategy behind that? What was the approach there?
Combination of three things. First, familiarity that definitely helped. Secondly, as I said, I'm moonlighting, so I wish I could do this full time, and I would certainly love to do that. But RPG Maker does a lot for you. It also constrains you, but I feel like for the vision I had in mind, RPG Maker fit the bill. And the last thing is that related to familiarity, I enjoy using RPG Maker. It's almost like a for fun thing as well.
Kind of skipping ahead briefly, with a Japanese RPG built in a pixelated style, is that, again, you're kind of circling back to those constraints, not specifically with RPG Maker anymore, but with that art style, because Japanese RPG, or even just Japanese art style, is a very specific thing in itself, and then you add that pixelated layer on top of it. I would imagine there's some difficulty in kind of conveying that. Kind of talk to me about that for a second.
Well, the art style was also, something again that I'm familiar with, and I feel like given the small team and small budget, going for a lo-fi pixelated style, certainly helps. Like I cannot do right now, like a super AC AAA graphic productions. Yeah. So I went for something I'm familiar with to be able to tell a deep story, and that's why I combined like that typical 2D overhead mode, but I also added like these vignettes, like comic style cutscenes, to be able to tell those more like important parts of the story, so that people can see the characters in higher detail and all that.
So with those constraints in RPG Maker, is that why you chose to do turn-based combat, or was that something more geared towards that Japanese art style? Kind of where was the strategy behind bringing that into the game?
Combination of, the Japanese style of classic RPGs, but also, it's a big world with a lot of different enemies. So
I saw that.
Variety.
Yeah, I saw that. You have like over 100 plus, right?
Yes, unique enemy designs.
Yeah.
So with turn-based, I feel easier to give each a unique strategy and all that. It's still a challenge to design the battles to make them unique in particular. Yeah. But the programming behind it, it's more of a asset in small AI problem, whereas with, for example, action RPGs, it's a lot of also the physics, and you add a lot of layers that I feel like a lot of the reason why action RPGs tend to recycle more like enemies and assets, just because there's a lot more work you have to put on each enemy. Yeah. So for the story I wanted to tell, I felt like turn-based would allow me to go bigger.
With the turn-based combat, is it all turn-based? Is it all in that kind of setting and that art style, or is there some where you step out and you do it in a different setting, like actually within the map worlds, or kind of how does that work in the game?
All combat is in the turn-based combat, but there's a few things during exploration that also, like for example, in a very cold mountain, you have to watch for not freezing. So you have to hide in like some flowers that keep you warm. Really? Yeah. Once you're warm again, you can keep exploring. So there's also some places where boulders are falling. So you have to watch out for those. So I did spice up exploration a bit sometimes, again, to keep things fresh. One important aspect about Manafinder is that the world is pretty hostile. Yeah. It's beautiful, but hostile. Life is harsh. But I wanted to showcase that it's not only about the enemies, the monsters. It's also like the environment itself. It has some harsh places, not fit for settlements of mankind.
Is the story, is the game world itself, is it linear or is it kind of more open? Being an RPG, I think a lot of people assume all RPGs are just open world, which is obviously not the case, but some of them are kind of like semi, some of them are fully linear, some of them are open. Where does this world fall into that category?
Following the Japanese style playbook of RPGs, it's more linear, definitely. The final chapter though, choice matters a lot, so there's like different routes to be specific, but it is linear, yes, but the final chapter, which ultimately dictates how the story ends, is completely different, with completely different areas, completely different enemies and all that. So it's mostly linear, but with a combination of forking paths at the end. Yeah. Efficient.
With performance in mind, is the game controller compatible or is it just PC desktop compatible?
Well, I got lucky that the engine just supports controller by default. So
RPG it supports it by default. Oh, that is nice.
And luckily, since turn-based RPGs don't require a lot of input.
True.
It's pretty basic. You just need 3 buttons and D-pad or joystick.
I guess we're jumping way ahead here, but RPG Maker, this game is right now, it's only for PC. With stuff like Unity is extremely good at the porting process, where it streamlines a lot of things for you really easily. Game Maker is not quite as good, but it is close behind it in a lot of areas. But there are other stuff out there, like I guess you could say Godot, for example, which is it's not new per se anymore, but it is not as good when it comes to porting. RPG Maker, I am not as familiar with. Is the porting process for that, and I'm not saying you will port this game, but is the porting process for that as streamlined? Is it as easy, or are there more obstacles for that?
Not as easy. And the engine doesn't support that by default.
Okay.
You have to. There are ways to do it, but no, not easy.
Gotcha. And that's not something you're planning right now? You want to keep it on PC at the moment?
I'm in early talks with a publisher.
Okay.
And they might help me out with the porting. But it's too early to say anything official. Like, I can confirm it's coming to consoles, but it's definitely something I'm looking into.
We kind of talked about different elements of the game world, but we didn't talk about the game world as a whole. So can you touch on exactly what players will experience in the game, kind of how it evolves, things of that nature?
Touching briefly, like the game world, it's a small floating world. And by small, I mean the game is 12 to 15 hours long. And you'll get to explore most of the world. An RPG always has excuses to have you run around the entire world and all these different areas. And it's a world, as I mentioned earlier, that's dominated by very powerful beasts. Man is not superior in this world. However, they did manage to exploit mana stones, which are these stones found in the wild. And with that, they are able to, make protective barriers that shield them from those deadly beasts. So in the world, there's only one kingdom because they managed to find an immense supply of mana stones. But the king there is pretty much a tyrant, to put it briefly. So he has little tolerance for crime or anyone who believes in different ideologies or anything. So he just exiles people and takes pleasure in doing that. You start that way, getting exiled from the one kingdom.
Okay.
And pretty much no one knows much about the outside world because you're just told if you go out, you'll die. So people are happy with staying in that kingdom.
Yep.
And that's where the game starts. You make your way to a settlement that also has a barrier, but the difference is they don't have a supply of mana. So that's why they hire the more able exiles to find the mana, and that's the job of being a Manafinder.
When you're developing combat from the technical side of things, how do you approach, especially with a turn-based game, how do you approach that combat? Is it procedurally generated, where it kind of it takes that tax off you, where in a sense it's randomized? Is it? I'm assuming RPG Maker does not have the coding capacity to kind of, I don't want to say learn, but where it picks up on specific patterns similar to Souls-like combat, and then it can generate moves based off of that. Is it just fully randomized? Kind of how does that work when you're coding it?
So each enemy has unique AI, and it's all handcrafted.
So that had to be a huge part of development for you.
Yes. Yeah. Some of it is reactive, actually. Like if they see, especially, for example, human enemies, if they see you use a fire ore to become fire, they too can use ores, so they'll probably use water, and every turn they'll be keeping you on your toes. Some enemies are reactive like that, others aren't, but each enemy has a unique AI. It was definitely one of the biggest aspects of development.
Moving into kind of other elements of the industry in itself, something that could impact this game. Localization is a very big part of development right now. With this game specifically, you'd mentioned you have those cutscenes with, there's wording that's going across the screen, stuff like that. How do you approach localization? Because there's a strategy behind it. You can't have your words baked into the images, so it can't just be, you know, I don't know, a JPEG. It's got to actually be coding on top of that. There's strategy on top of that where you want to make it easier so you can just kind of interchange that and do it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So how do you approach localization? How big of a part of this game is that going to be?
Localization was huge from the start. I'm bilingual, like my native language is actually Spanish. So even though I developed the game in English because that's how I played RPGs all my life.
Yeah.
And because honestly speaking, like US is just the biggest market. But you know, Spanish is important to me at a personal level. So I had localization in mind from the start. It's a bit hard because instead of, for example, when you create like all the dialogues, you have to export them to a separate text file. So sometimes in the engine you only see like the key of the message you have to render. So sometimes you just see like, okay, text 1, text 2, text 3, text 4.
Okay.
And you have to remember more or less like, okay, this is what they were saying here. But then that makes localization very easy because
you could just plug and play basically on your end.
Yeah, you just replace all the values in Spanish. However, I had to choose a font that was, you know, friendly with both languages. And for example, Spanish, I feel like it's more verbose, like it's just longer to write stuff. So with dialogues, it's okay because there's auto text wrapping. But for example, on skill abilities or item descriptions, the space is limited.
Yeah.
So you have to be extra careful there. With, you know, you have to sometimes describe things in a shorter way and you have to just get creative. For the other thing you mentioned with the images, that's definitely something that I had in mind, not just for the images but also for the UI elements.
Yeah.
Everything that's not rendered by the text engine of the RPG Maker itself, I try to make it more like understandable on imagery alone. And that's why the cutscenes are supported by text, but that text is rendered by the engine, it's not part of the image.
Yeah.
So I'm also looking into localizing. I'm working on the Japanese, but they're helping me out with that.
That was going to be my next question, yeah, if it was.
Mostly because of the genre, and you know, I showcased on Tokyo Game Show last year and Indie Live Expo, which is also like a pretty, you know, Japanese-centric event.
And plus, to be fair, with Japan in mind, the Asian market, the US market is still the US market is the largest market out there right now. But without a question, the Asian market is quickly becoming one of the biggest in the world. And I think in the next few years, it will be the biggest in the world. And that's all of Asia. And obviously, there's some political restrictions surrounding gameplay in some countries, specifically China. Yeah. But I think that will change in the next few years, and I think, you know, that's going to be the target audience that devs start kind of catering to, as opposed to the US. And that's just me. Maybe I'm crazy. I mean, I'm not the wisest person on the planet by any means.
No.
But
I made my game ready to be localizable. I wish I could do all languages, but
no, that's just not realistic. Yeah,
it's a very text-heavy game.
Yeah,
it's over 40,000 words to translate.
You're right. You're writing
English, a book. Spanish, I did it myself, and honestly, I was tired by the end. It's just a lot of text to translate.
Yep.
But that also makes it expensive, right? Like I cannot, like if I go to a, French localization team, it's gonna be a lot of money, and I don't have budget. So future localizations will depend on, the success of the game.
No, that completely makes sense.
It's more about, as I said, with consoles, it's more about I just want people to play. The more people that can enjoy Manafinder, the happier I am. That's my goal.
Is there anything that you think we really kind of missed that really needs to be touched on?
Choices matter in this game because they ultimately lead to one of these, to the different routes.
Yeah.
But also the way characters react and other small things. Your choices also have, consequences. Some short term, some longer term. It's something I love. Where choices actually matter. I wish I had a budget to make them all matter in more significant ways, but again, you have to be mindful of that. Like, I'm not saying you should expect every yes no question to, but definitely you'll, for example, see characters react angrily to you or happy about the choice you made or question why you made that choice. So I hope you also enjoy,
it's
making one of the many choices.
I was going to say, it's a great touch for any RPG. And me, I mean, whenever I get talking to devs and we talk about, different choices and how they impact the world, I think instantly of like Fable. And what is it called? The morality meter. I think that was what it was called, where you either were good or bad, things like that. Like, I love elements like that in these in games. And obviously I would assume that it's not as in depth as Fable would be, but it still has that element where you can see where your decisions where they make kind of an impact on the world, which is very cool to see.
That is definitely more influenced by Western RPGs, but again, it's not at the same level as Fable, but it's definitely something I put a lot of extra emphasis.
When you say so with Japanese RPGs, is it different? Is it something much more focused on kind of these like progression of events? Kind of walk me through that.
Yeah, for the most part, not all, but most series, sometimes you don't even make choices. It's very strictly linear.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do get extra bonuses or stuff depending on side quests you make, but choices don't really matter or are not even a gameplay element. There are exceptions, of course, like the Shin Megami Tensei series, and where choices matter a lot.
Yeah.
But I feel like choices being very important is definitely more of a Western RPG, thing you would expect out of.
That's fascinating. I never thought about it that way. Maybe it's the narcissist in me, but when I look at game development right now, I think there's a lot of great elements to it. But with anything, there's always some kind of negative attributes that can be put on something. And with game development, it obviously is no exception to that rule. There are some negative aspects within the gaming world. And for you specifically, if you could target one specific thing in the gaming world that needs fixed, that needs attention, what specifically would that be?
Sometimes you as a dev want to make like a way more ambitious world or experience. But you have to be realistic with the situation right now in the market. It's very competitive.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, I feel. I personally do like that everyone can make a game now in a sort of way. Like, it's more accessible than has ever been right now.
Yeah.
Like, you can download the RPG Maker and try it. However, the problem, in my opinion, is, competing with, the multi-million-dollar productions and all that. And ultimately, you're fighting for the attention of consumers.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult. So if there's one thing I feel would help, is if the marketplaces like Steam and all that would treat indies differently and maybe help them by taking less of a cut or things like that. Or maybe after you reach a certain threshold, they give you back some money to, incentivize you to make more games. Because it's hard to turn this into a profitable, not even profitable, but something that you can keep on going.
Yeah.
And it's like, I feel like a vicious cycle because of how difficult it is to, make money. You sometimes have to be conservative about the risks you can take. So it's a lot of back and forth. And for indies, I feel like it's extra harsh. And that's why sometimes a lot of them have to, seek publishers and all that, or compromise their visions.
Yep.
So if there's something I could change, is hopefully to make it easier to get something out of this, monetarily speaking.
It's a double-edged sword for sure.
Exactly, yeah. But I know that the big companies that hold the markets, I know they have some space, I feel, to help a bit in this equation. They have a lot of power in this equation. That's my point.
Oh, yeah. No, they definitely do. It's interesting because Steam, when it first got started, Steam 5+ years ago or whatever, a while back, I don't think, and I could be way off, but for me, looking back, Steam never was a place where like AAA games were like huge. It was something for indie devs. It was something for developers or smaller teams making their games, showcasing their games. And that was kind of how you got exposure. And that was kind of the nicer element of game dev a decade ago. It was harder to make games, but it was easier to get them exposed to more audiences. Whereas nowadays, it's easier than ever to make a game, but it's also harder than ever to make a game because of that specifically. And I think AAA companies have leaned into Steam, which is great for players on PC, but it impacts developers who are on Steam in a negative way, because then their games get bumped down because of all of that funding and all of that marketing that kind of pushes them off to the side. So it's as you said, like it's a vicious cycle, and it is unfortunate. It's just like there's so many layers to it at this point, and it's just
it's a very complicated problem. And there's no easy way to point the finger at anyone.
Yeah,
that's also part of the problem itself. Like how do we fix this?
Yeah. Do you have a release window you can touch on yet, or no? You're just kind of...
Yes.
You do? Okay.
Started that it's fall of this year.
Okay.
The game is almost ready, but it's a lot of, polishing and testing.
Yeah.
And for indies now, you also have to be wary of, you don't want to release next to a AAA.
Yep.
Especially of the same genre. Like, I don't want to release next to, for example, like, let's say a Final Fantasy title. I mean, I love Final Fantasy, but everyone's going to be talking about that RPG, and everyone's going to look at you. Finding a window where you don't overlap with other games that will be on everyone's mind.